I can totally understand why Evangelion 3.0 had a bad reputation for such a long time. Within the structure of the Rebuild series, it's essentially the darkest hour part of a screenplay, the moment where everything seems lost and hopeless. It's the part of the narrative that makes the eventual reversal of fortune and triumph of the heroes even more satisfying and sweet. But usually that section of a screenplay lasts like 5 or 10 minutes, whereas 3.0 is a hour and a half version of that. It's kind of miserable, it's confusing, a lot of the action is pretty bad, and it doesn't really function on its own as a film. It's not a satisfying experience. But I have always been a defender of 3.0, and a big part of that is how much I like all the stuff in there to do with my absolute best boy, Kaworu Nagisa. So, a little context on this for me. In my life, I would say I've had two fanfic pairings I've been really invested in. One is Liara and Femshep from the video game series Mass Effect, and the other is Kaworu and Shinji. These are the only two pairings that I've written fanfic of. Admittedly, in both cases, it was when I was a teenager. And in both cases, part of my interest in that fanfic is extending out those moments of intimacy that were in the initial work. This can be one of the nice things about fanfiction, because most narratives are pretty heavily based around conflict, which means there isn't always quite as much time for seeing the mundane but pleasant parts of a relationship. Outside of like Nancy Meyers films, there's just not a whole lot of art dedicated to those moments. But fanfic allows us to take a break from conflict-driven narratives and just sort of luxuriate in relationship intimacy in a way that's not always possible in the work itself. Personally, I would love a Mass Effect DLC where Liara and Femshep go furniture shopping, but until that happens, I'll have to settle for fic. And this desire to extend out intimacy is particularly intensified in the case of Kaworushin, because despite his prominence in marketing and in End of Evangelion, Kaworu's time in the series is notably brief, only one episode. And that episode is a relationship in fast forward. It's this intense bout of intimacy before a sudden shift towards tragedy. It's exactly the kind of thing that makes for a good fanfic. And you know, with every Rebuild film, what they're basically doing is taking part of the original series and in some way heightening the imagery and events even more, making it even larger. So in the original episode, Asuka is out of action, the original Rei is dead, and all of Shinji's friends have moved from Tokyo Free, partially because the explosion during the previous Eva battle wiped out a good portion of it. And so the setting of this show now feels like this abandoned ghost town. It's evocative and scary, and it seems as if Shinji has no one left to turn to, no hope. And then Kaworu appears, this being of pure acceptance and charisma and grace. He's someone who is totally, unashamedly interested in pursuing intimacy with Shinji. He's this lifeboat when everything has become dark and seemingly lost. So 3.0 gives us an even more extreme version of that. Not only does everyone now hate Shinji because he destroyed the world, but he's also made the world alien and strange. Nerve is now literally a broken down husk of its former self, and it's surrounded by this deeply odd environment, strange in a way that we don't even understand as a viewer. One of my favourite examples of this is a shot where we see teeth growing out of the earth, which, as far as I know, is never really explained in the movies themselves. And so Shinji's relationship with Kaworu is even more heightened here, because not only have his friends left, in this version they all now view him as a demon that caused for an impact, and rendered the entire world hostile and alien. So Kaworu, as the only person extending him any friendship, is his only relief from that. At the same time, there's something different about Kaworu in this version. He's almost frightening here, because on one level, yeah, he's this relief for Shinji, but his dialogue is even more odd and alien now, even more detached. Somehow, Kaworu in this movie has gone from slightly ethereal bishonen to something genuinely strange and distanced, which is heightened by the fact that he seems to almost be going through the motions here. His dialogue suggests that he's lived this life before, acting out a story he knows the ending to, but that Shinji doesn't. I remember when the rebuilds were coming out, the idea that there was some kind of time loop or universal reincarnation going on was a really hot topic in the fandom. Some people really hated the idea and did not want it to be the case. And since that last film took about a decade to be made, there was a lot of time for folks to become entrenched in their positions. The idea of a setting being caught in a loop is actually pretty recurrent in Japanese pop culture, and in a lot of stuff Anno is a fan of. For instance, in the Devil Lady manga, a sequel to Devilman, it's revealed that every version of the Devilman story is canon. It all takes place in the same universe, in which God keeps resetting the earth, a process that's compared to allowing different branches to grow on a bonsai tree before cutting them short. The ending of Ideon also suggests some kind of universal reincarnation, and this is the thing that's played with in Gundam too. For instance, there's this obscure Hasegawa manga in which it's revealed that the series takes place in the universe that came about after the end of Ideon. It's also something that Harutoshi Fukui, the writer of Gundam Unicorn, has played with. He wrote this short called The Light of Life, in which it's pretty clearly implied that every alternate universe of Gundam actually takes place in the same setting, just with the Turn A Gundam periodically wiping out civilization and then healing it through psychoframe magic. I'm not saying you should like any of these ideas. I personally really dig the Devilman one, and I sort of admire that Turn A one for just how dumb it is, but it's more to say that the concept of some kind of a loop going on in the rebuilds never really bothered me, because I really just saw it as Anno gesturing at another thing from media he likes. Like, oh hey, this is sort of like Devilman, that's cute. But I think they made the right decision in the final rebuild film by acknowledging that this was kind of a thing, but not explaining in any way how it works. It's just kind of there, another example of the ways in which the world of Eva feels mysterious and unknowable. The concept of a universal loop is one that can be found in several religions, and also in philosophies such as eternalism. It's also a concept that the writer of Watchmen, Alan Moore, has been playing with a lot recently. His 1,000-page novel, Jerusalem, was partially designed to explain his belief that time is an illusion.
You know, when I was reading Jerusalem and I was talking to you about this, like the idea that comes up is that, you know, as you're explaining here, that essentially every single moment, every single second, every single thing in the universe is essentially inalterable. It already exists. It already has existed. It already will exist. And that includes every second, every moment, every thought and memory in your life. And that essentially upon death, there is nowhere for else anything to go other than back to the beginning. So that we are essentially existing eternally, but like we do exist forever, but in our own same life over and over and over again.
And that always seems like the first time.
In the case of Evangelion, I think the concept of the loop works best in the relationship between Kaworu and Shinji. In the original series, Kaworu faces his death with an inevitability. It's like he understands some greater processes at work that we don't, and so he doesn't fear his death. And this is now heightened by the idea that he's been experiencing this countless times before. He wants what's best for Shinji to a point, but he's also come to accept that this is basically how things go, that this tragedy between them is essentially preordained, and while they can try and find happiness within that structure, there's no real changing the outcome. Something I'm surprised isn't brought up more when discussing this is just how much the relationship between Kaworu and Shinji seems to have its basis in classic BL, particularly in the initial 1970s run of BL, manga like Heart of Thomas and The Song of Wind and Trees. Like the Bishonen from those works, Kaworu is an ethereal, ghostly figure. Like those works too, he's associated with European culture, in this case classical music. And then there's also his tragic end, itself very reminiscent of the conclusions of these works. It's fitting that after the episode's release, Anno was interviewed by the magazine June, which had published a lot of those early BL manga. In that interview, Anno explicitly says he chose the writer of the episode, Satsukawa Akio, because he was good at writing homoerotic scenes. Even the theme of loops and eternal recurrence has a grounding in early BL. In Heart of Thomas, one of the foundational BL texts, the story is set in motion when the titular Thomas dies, but he's then replaced by a strange, somewhat malevolent doppelganger. These themes are played with really well in the very good, very Tumblr aesthetic film blog favourite Summer Vacation 1999, an adaptation of Heart of Thomas. Unlike Heart of Thomas, which takes place in the 1800s in Germany, Summer Vacation 1999 takes place in an ambiguous retro-futurist setting. It still has the same general plot structure and concept as the manga. A student dies after proclaiming his love to another and is then replaced by a mysterious, somewhat antagonistic double. But this version has a more overtly dreamlike quality. It takes place over a summer in a boarding school in which only a few students are staying and there's no adults. And the whole thing feels very timeless and dislocated in a very uncanny way. Lots of images are used to play with a sense of recurrence. For instance, echoing rings of water in the school's nearby lake, and also trains are a big part of it, with the doppelgangers arriving by train in this version, which bookends the narrative. There's a particular scene in this movie that I think is a great case study in this idea of loops and how they relate to these doomed romances. Towards the end of the film, the story's doppelganger begs the main character to die with him. He says that if they die together, they'll be reborn together, trapped in an endless loop of rebirth. As my friend Rayclone said while we watched this is so fucked up, I love it. The effect here is a kind of eerie pleasure. There's this mixture of nostalgia and the weird going on, of embracing recurrence as a way to avoid death and remain forever trapped in a doomed romance. The doppelganger, whose name is not Kaworu but is Kaoru, suggests that they can enter an infinite loop of re-experiencing life, but always in the same bodies. Of course, there's also the question of whether or not to trust him here, because what he's describing also sounds like it could just be death. And actually, that's a feeling that hangs over the whole film. I mean, this school, even, is this real? Is it a dream? The mixture of homeliness and an idealized summer with the hauntingly empty, liminal feeling of the location just makes the whole thing feel off. The school grounds are mostly idyllic, but with occasional suggestions that some kind of a war has taken place. And the lack of any adult characters creates this ghostly, empty feeling. It creates the feeling of a world that could go on forever, basically unchanged. A routine that endlessly repeats, drifting in and out. Kaworu in 3.0 embodies a similar feeling of repetition. Nowhere is this more evident than in this version of his death. And this is the scene that has really broken my brain. I think I view this moment as the absolute high point of the Rebuild series. It's the only point in those movies that for me comes close to reaching a similar level of iconicity as the original show. The whole setup is just amazing. You've got this impenetrable barrier between Kaworu and Shinji. The difference between his and Shinji's dialogue is so good. Shinji is at his absolute lowest moment, whereas Kaworu has reached this acceptance. Because, again, for him, this is just how things go. He dies, Shinji is sad, but he's found peace in that repetition. I think one of the coolest ideas in this movie is this sense that living in that state of repetition, this loop, has fundamentally dehumanized Kaworu. Not in a negative sense exactly, it's just that he can't relate to human beings who experience life in a linear manner anymore. Kaworu's dialogue in this scene reaches this religious reverie, filled with allusions and references to concepts and ideas that neither Shinji or the audience can really understand. Kaworu here is almost talking what seems like a parody of Eva lore apocrypha, and in my favourite moment of the whole thing, Shinji just starts shaking his head and says, defeated, he doesn't understand what Kaworu is saying. The way it holds this shot in wide really adds to this. The duration of Shinji collapsed against the barrier, and Kaworu static, peaceful, and unmoving. It's two people who are intimate but fundamentally failing to connect. And I like the idea that that's because they're completely separate beings. Kaworu is this individual who is aware of existing in a kind of non-linear cycle, just resides in a very different kind of consciousness. To bring up Alan Moore again, Kaworu in this reading becomes almost a Dr. Manhattan-like figure, someone whose totally different experience of time has shifted his relationship to life. In discussing his novel Jerusalem, Alan Moore has said that for him, the idea that we all perpetually relive our lives over infinity is a reason why all life should be seen as eternal and ancient, and also worthy of equal respect. Ava is using eternalism in a very different way, more as a metaphor for cycles of depression. And 3.0 plus 1.0 ends up telling a story about breaking that cycle, which it does, maybe unsurprisingly, through the imagery of leaving a train station. But I enjoy 3.0 for the way it lets us live in that loop, that eerie place of alien nostalgia, of trying to find hope within a strange circular structure. It's pretty aesthetic, no?